So if you're watching this video, you probably want to tell the difference between the INTP and the ISTP. You yourself may be wondering whether you are one or the other. And I am going to give you a framework with which to tell the difference between each of these types in cognitive terms. But before we go any further, I need you to do something for me. I need you to take the whole N versus S dichotomy and throw it out the window. You do not need it. It will trip you up. As I've explored in a previous video, the MBTI dichotomies are not effective. They do not work. They do not correlate directly with cognitive functions. And a lot of the reason ISTPs constantly mistype as INTPs is because they are equally intuitive. What differs is the manner in which they engage their intuitive function. So with that all out of the way, let's jump right into the video, starting with the dominant stacks. The dominant stack of the INTP is introverted thinking and introverted sensing. Both of these types share introverted thinking as the dominant function. And this does not in any way, shape or form indicate that these types are somehow robotic and emotionless. In fact, introverted thinking as the dominant function is constantly dipping in to introverted feeling. And as a whole, the influence of the dominant function on identity formation is highly overrated. So because the INTP has got introverted sensing as a convergent auxiliary to its introverted thinking dominant function, this is therefore a type who is very precise. They tend to fine-tune definitions, they tend to work on existing frameworks and tend to tinker with them. So let's first define the functions. Introverted thinking is nothing more than an internally directed objective codec. It is somebody gazing at an internal landscape and trying to quantify and collate and understand objective data in a cerebral manner. Introverted sensing, the convergent auxiliary of the INTP, and very much the lens to which introverted thinking is assigned, gazes very specifically at these objective codecs and seeks to fine-tune existing definitions. As a result, the INTP is not a holistic thinker. They are not an intuitive thinking type. They are a sensing thinking type. The INTP gazes at specific values within the brain, and they lock onto these internal details. INTPs will emphasize the importance of correct terminology. They will emphasize the importance of operating within a strict framework, a framework which is proven to be true because of the concrete nature of introverted sensing. The INTP very much reflects upon objective memories as they are constantly tinkering in order to make any given system, any given framework, more effective and more correct down to the fine, minute detail. And due to the concrete and oftentimes past tense nature of the introverted sensing lens to which introverted thinking in this instance is assigned, the INTP is therefore very much a sentinel of knowledge. The INTP generally does not like to turn theories on the head. And if they are innovating upon anything, it'll be oftentimes in a very small and minute way. This does not mean they do not have the capacity to innovate, but oftentimes they prefer to do so using very small increments, which will often take a lot of time. Furthermore, owing to the very concrete nature of introverted sensing, the INTPs are very certain oftentimes of their definitions. They're very certain in the way that they speak and convey information. For as long as this framework is oriented more towards objective substrate and less towards necessarily the emotions of other people, the INTP will generally carry a lot of authority in what they're saying. But oftentimes an INTP in their critique, for example, can get so caught up in a specific detail that they very much miss the big picture of what another person is saying, or fail to necessarily say the underlying meaning behind a given theory because they're focusing on the details. And the degree to which an INTP can expand their internal horizons to perceive a bigger picture, blur the details and instead see how all of these various values are relating to one another on a larger scale, will be proportionate to the degree to which this particular INTP in question can effectively dip into introverted intuition from an introverted sensing standpoint. And generally speaking, owing to the concrete lens to which introverted thinking in this instance is assigned, the INTP tends to be very stuck in the habits. They tend to be very habitual creatures. They tend to have constructed a framework of how things should operate in a certain manner, and absent their convergent, playful nature of introverted thinking with which they like to gradually change in an incremental fashion their frameworks over time, make slight alterations as they try to get the balance perfect, the INTP will be typically very methodical. This isn't to say that the INTP likes to create plans as such, but rather to say in the general day-to-day framework, the INTP again tends to be highly habitual. And the ISTP is a complete and utter opposite of this. The ISTP has introverted intuition connected to the introverted thinking dominant function. And as such, the ISTP is actually the true intuitive thinker of each of these types. And they are by comparison to the very precise and oftentimes methodical INTP, much more bombastic in nature. This is because introverted intuition is the exact opposite of introverted sensing, and therefore this is a lens, again directed internally towards their introverted thinking codec, which is much more holistic in nature. We have a lens which is very much wide in scope, encompassing a large swath of the introverted thinking codec. And therefore, with the ISTP, the details tend to very much blur together, as the ISTP instead focuses on how all of these vagaries within their internal mind correspond to each other. And as such, the ISTP is very much an innovator and a visionary, whereas the INTP can be relied upon to fine-tune definitions. It is the ISTP who is by comparison much more, in an introverted thinking sense, individualistic. And owing to the very future tense orientation of introverted intuition, the ISTP will often form intense visions of the future, a vision of where they would like to be in 10 years, a vision of how they would like their skill set to progress. And they will often have a highly individualized manner of seeing these visions realized. And relative to the degree to which the ISTP can effectively dip into introverted feeling from the dominant standpoint, the type will often form their identity upon what they wish to embody in the future. And the degree to which an ISTP is tenacious in seeing their vision realized will vary completely between individuals. And it will oftentimes be relative to the degree to which an ISTP can dip into introverted sensing from the introverted intuitive standpoint in order to make that vision more concrete in nature. Because otherwise, ISTPs can go their entire lives forming vision after vision after vision and getting very excited about the vision, but not necessarily holding onto the vision long enough to see it realized in reality. But many of the world's innovators, whether they're actors, whether they're martial artists, whether they're scientists, have been ISTPs because of the manner in which introverted thinking in this instance is connected to introverted intuition. And this is a major reason why ISTPs so often mistype as INTJs, because in terms of an MBTI dichotomy, at least half, I'd say, of ISTPs correspond perfectly to an introverted intuitive thinking judging score, because the ISTPs oftentimes really obsesses over mastering a holistic framework and seeing a vision realized in reality. And owing to their divergent stack, the ISTP is oftentimes so much more intense than the INTP. And whereas the INTP can oftentimes be more relied upon in the implementation of protocol, the ISTP will quite often gravitate toward a position of relative leadership, where they can survey a larger holistic framework and oftentimes heavily rely on other people to focus on the details that are involved in seeing that vision realized. And again, the degree to which the INTP and the ISTP's dominant stacks will depart from one another will be very much relative to the degree to which the convergent auxiliary of each of these types can dip in to its natural opposite. Introverted intuition in the case of the INTP, and introverted sensing in the case of the ISTP. And now let's visit the opposing stack. Both of these types have extroverted feeling as an oppositional function. And for this reason, both of these types tend to be much more socially observant than they are socially active. And oftentimes, owing to the hyperdivergent nature of this opposing function, for as many acquaintances each of these types will have, they will tend to let very few people into their close inner circle. However, do not make the assumption that either of these types are antisocial or unfriendly. Oftentimes it's the very opposite. Oftentimes both of these types are very curious about people. They are often heavily invested in how people view them, and they will often use social situations as an opportunity to refine their various frameworks, whether these frameworks are social in nature or otherwise. And the degree to which either of these types will actively influence a social atmosphere will always be relative to the fluidity of the dominant opposing axis. Because when either of these types flip on their axis, they become effectively an extroverted feeling dominant, and therefore someone who's very happy to actively influence and maintain any given social atmosphere. But oftentimes, this will only be done in an environment whereby these types are very comfortable. However, what differs between each of these types is the extroverted lens to which their extroverted feeling is assigned. The INTP has an extroverted intuitive lens, therefore this is an individual who is very much keenly observant of the plethoric social atmosphere. They are oftentimes very effective at reading a room, and simultaneously keenly aware of the social protocol and etiquette that is to be followed in any given situation. And one of the most underestimated abilities of the INTP is their social intelligence. Oftentimes is the type who's so much more aware of socially what's going on than another. And the hyperdivergent nature of their opposing stack makes this type, relative to the degree to which they have a healthy relationship with their extroverted feeling oppositional function, one of the most naturally socially intelligent of them all. And the plethoric nature of this extroverted intuitive lens proclivicates the INTP towards a kind of networking ability, whereby they have multiple different social circles, acquaintances or otherwise, which they are very happy to dip in and out of. And as extroverted intuition within the INTP is the divergent auxiliary to the opposing function, it is simultaneously the authority function of the cognitive stack. And therefore, even though it is primarily assigned to the employment of extroverted feeling, its authoritative nature encourages the INTP to take a holistic attitude towards life. Because as much as the INTP will focus on the very minute details within their brain, the the authoritative influence of an extroverted intuitive perspective will oftentimes make the INTP very much unwilling to rush to assumptions and generalizations, and will give the type a certain creatively playful nature. And as this intuitive authority function is oriented externally, the INTP will generally be more experimental upon an external medium than they are an internal one. And now let's take the ISTP. In this instance, it is extroverted sensing which is the divergent auxiliary to extroverted feeling. And therefore, while the INTP is much more observant of a plethoric social atmosphere, by comparison, the ISTP's social gaze is much more focused and intense. Whereas the extroverted feeling, extroverted intuition of the INTP tends to be very observant and predictive of a plethoric social atmosphere, the ISTPs tend to lock on to the present tense of a social situation and be much more reactive than they are predictive. And it is this extrovert sensing divergent auxiliary which makes the ISTP oftentimes very socially intense, because they very much lock into the here and now of the present moment. And by comparison to the INTP, tend to pay very little attention when they're engaged in a specific social activity to the wider picture. However, when it comes to social microtransactions, the ISTP tends to be the more adept of the two. And particularly when this type rotates on a dominant opposing axis, they can actually have a very intense charisma. And as this divergent auxiliary of extroverted sensing is very much the authority function of the ISTP, this tends to in some instances give this type a more concrete orientation. And as such, while an INFJ, for example, like myself, will be very theoretical and abstract in his introverted intuition, introverted thinking musings, the ISTP's dominant stack will be more concerned with the tangible and the concrete. And this is because of the authoritative influence of extroverted sensing within this type. And again, this sets this type up as being more an innovator, an inventor, than they are necessarily a theorist. However, owing to the authoritative influence of extroverted sensing within this type, relative to the degree to which they have developed their introverted intuition, there is a danger for this type to be overly spontaneous, to be overly contained within any given moment without necessarily thinking about the consequences of their actions. And in this instance, for as much as they may be thinking of some far-off future prediction, they may very well act, or should I say, react, without necessarily thinking about the consequences. And since extroverted sensing proclivicates this type towards the concrete and tangible, it is not entirely unreasonable for an ISTP in the heat of a moment to spend an unreasonable amount of money and resources on an attractive object or concrete experience that, let's be honest, they didn't really need in the first place. And while I already have brushed over the attitudes of these types, I'll now visit them in a little bit more depth. The introverted sensing of the INTP is convergent in nature. Therefore, this type is still very much responsible for their introverted thinking frameworks, but they are taking their very focused and intense introverted sensing lens and taking responsibility for a small portion of the introverted thinking landscape at a time. Therefore, this type is still very much theoretical in nature. Therefore, this type still very much forms their own independent opinions and views. However, as it is the introverted sensing which is convergent, generally they will take responsibility for their perception of past concrete objective experiences and refine and construct new frameworks in a very careful, methodical, and indeed reliable manner. And these frameworks can be as much theoretical as they are oriented more towards a skill set. And as it is their introverted sensing which is convergent, it is the extroverted intuition of the INTP which tends to be more divergent. Therefore, they do not take as much active responsibility for the external plethoric world as they do their precise internal world. Connected as it is primarily to their extroverted feeling oppositional function, the INTP's divergent opposing stack is very much socially observant by nature. They do not take responsibility for the emotional states of other people as much as they do observe social customs and abide by the emotional regulations of any given situation. Now let's take the ISTP. The introverted intuition of the ISTP is convergent. Therefore, this is a type who puts a lot of effort into constructing new and original perspectives, new and original visions of a future. And they tend to innovate upon their introverted thinking circuits in an extremely holistic manner. This is where they take responsibility. While their extroverted sensing and extroverted feeling are extremely divergent in nature, and therefore much more observant and generally reactive as it concerns social situations more than mechanical ones, ISTP will often put a lot of effort into mastering various skill sets, compiling existing objective data in a new and original manner. And now let's take the unconscious functions while also addressing their attitudes. So each of these types share what is primarily an unconscious extroverted thinking. However, this extroverted thinking will not always be unconscious. It is not the same as the extroverted thinking of, say, an ISFJ and INFJ respectively. And as such, both of these types will continuously dip in and out of a conscious extroverted thinking, which is more concerned with the external objective order than the internal one. But it is rather the perception of this extroverted thinking order which tends to reside in a more unconscious state within these types. And therefore the INTP will oftentimes dip more into an extroverted intuitive overview of the external logical landscape, whereas the ISTP will often dip into a more precise and detail-oriented overview of a more contained portion of the external world. Generally speaking, the INTP will dip into a conscious extroverted thinking, bypass extroverted sensing entirely, take a kind of an overview picture, and then struggle to implement details upon that external landscape. And then once they have achieved that holistic picture, they will employ the convergent extroverted sensing, the function with which they are more willing to exert control, in order to see the task carried out. However, they will oftentimes not be able to do so for very long. Most of the time, the INTP will be very much unaware of the concrete and tangible external world. And as such, they will not necessarily be aware of all the various external details. And it is not entirely unheard of for the INTP to be one of the more naturally clumsy of the 16 types. And it is generally quite the reverse for the ISTP. The ISTP will take their conscious extroverted thinking dip, bypass their extroverted intuition, in order to gaze at a very specific external value they want to exert influence over. However, when they are exerting influence, they will oftentimes, with great effort, activate their extroverted intuition in order to fit that specific value within a larger external landscape. And the degree to which they can maintain that extroverted intuitive perspective, which is oftentimes necessary for them to implement convergent change upon an extrovert thinking world, will be highly relative to the degree to which the ISTP can effectively alternate between the observation of specific details and the implementation of the external holistic mechanism or skill set. However, just as the INTP will primarily have a largely unconscious awareness of the concrete, tangible external world, the ISTP will, on the other hand, have a more unconscious awareness of the plethoric external world. And as extroverted intuition is so often more predictive owing to its abstract nature, the more unconscious the ISTP's extroverted intuition is, the greater difficulty this type will have foreseeing the relatively short-term consequences of their actions. And it is very much the unconscious extroverted intuition of the ISTP that lends them that kind of bombastic spontaneity they are sometimes known for. Oftentimes the ISTP will rely much more upon their introverted intuitive perception of a future outcome than a more natural innate sense of causality that the INTP, on the other hand, will be much more conscious of. Now let's visit the consciousness of the opposing stack. This gets a bit more tricky because both of these types have predominantly an unconscious introverted feeling, owing to its reverse orientation to the oppositional function, highly divergent, and oftentimes a great portion of this introverted feeling landscape will be dipped into from the position of the dominant function. Therefore, it is not entirely unheard of for both of these types to take a level of convergent responsibility for their identity, for their emotional landscape. However, this will always be highly relative to the degree to which either of these types can dip in to introverted feeling from the dominant perspective. And it is not entirely unheard of for both of these types to have very little idea of who they are, absent their introverted thinking utility. However, more often than not, both of these types will actually have quite a strong dip into introverted feeling from the dominant position. However, oftentimes an identity formed in this convergent state will be much more informed by their own objective frameworks, will be much more informed by their own introverted feeling attachment to skill sets, extroverted thinking utility, and knowledge base. And the portion of introverted feeling which is not effectively dipped into from the dominant position will, within both of these types, be heavily influenced by other people. And oftentimes, owing to both the unconscious and divergent nature of this primary introverted feeling, in formative years and indeed years in adulthood, people of both of these types, the INTP and the ISTP, will often assign other people the role of a kind of role model for them. And that way their identity can be unconsciously informed by other people relative to the extroverted feeling data they perceive, without the INTP or the ISTP needing to take conscious control of that identity. However, owing to the oftentimes unconsciousness of this process, the INTP and the ISTP won't often notice when they are emulating any given role model, or even consciously acknowledge the degree to which another person has influenced their own sense of self. And as this introverted feeling function is often dipped into from the dominant position, it is not entirely uncommon for people of both of these types to see introverted feeling as entirely optional. And it is in these situations where people of either of these types, in response to trauma or simple stress, essentially shut off an entire portion of the introverted feeling landscape, that they might begin to act in a way contrary to their usual character, and act in such a way heavily influenced by emotions they are no longer conscious of or responsible for. And oftentimes it is highly necessary for each of these types to develop an introverted thinking, dominant introverted feeling dip alongside a kind of dominant oppositional axis rotation in order to activate and maintain that deeper level of emotional maturity. And with regards to the opposing orientation of the divergent auxiliaries, The INTP has predominantly an unconscious introverted intuition. And the degree to which this introverted intuition is unconscious is often relative to the degree to which introverted sensing, the conversion auxiliary, can dip into it. And a well-rounded INTP is an individual who can navigate and fine-tune their introverted thinking frameworks while, as necessary, taking a broader, more holistic perspective through an effective SI and IDIP. However, even when introverted intuition within this type is not consciously employed, it is still nonetheless a reverse orientation to the type's authority function of extroverted intuition. And as such, the INTP is still someone who is compelled to acknowledge the broader picture. They're still compelled towards more broader, more holistic subjects. What differs is, in comparison to the ISTP, is a more precise manner in which they will navigate these various subjects. And the ISTP is again the exact opposite. The ISTP has an unconscious introverted sensing. However, this will be unconscious relative to the degree to which the ISTP can dip into it from the position of their conversion auxiliary. And a well-rounded ISTP is an individual who can, from that introverted intuitive perspective, more precisely zoom into the various details of their introverted thinking frameworks in order to refine and polish over time those otherwise holistic frameworks they are seeking to innovate upon. And it is through a dip into introverted sensing that the ISTP's visions can become much, much more concrete and far less of a wild abstract fantasy. However, as an unconscious function, introverted sensing is still very much the opposing orientation to the ISTP's authority function of extroverted sensing. And therefore, for as much as the ISTP likes to innovate and foresee distant ideal futures, they will still in many senses be kind of traditional. And as introverted sensing is connected to introverted feeling, whereas the identity and feelings of the INTP are much more abstract and undulating, the feelings and identity of the ISTP tend to be much more concrete, and again this lends this type that greater level of intensity. And just as the INTP can be stuck within their introverted thinking habits, the ISTP can be very much stuck within their own impulses. So a quick summary. The INTP is much more a sensing thinker. They are much more specific and much more precise, and they're very concrete in the way that they go about their introverted thinking machinations. The ISTP, on the other hand, is an intuitive thinker. They are much more broad and holistic. And whereas the INTP tends to reflect more upon the objective past, the ISTP tends to foresee objective future. And therefore, while the INTP adheres more towards, although not always, a more critic-like role, or even a guardian of knowledge, the ISTP is comparatively much more bombastic, and they oftentimes seek to innovate much more than they do refine. In regards to extroverted thinking, the INTP will take a plethoric view consciously of the external landscape and then activate extroverted sensing alongside extroverted thinking in order to focus on the details. The ISTP's utilization of extroverted thinking, on the other hand, will first of all take a very specific focus on what they are interested in, and then activate an otherwise unconscious extroverted intuition in order to connect that specific component to the bigger external picture. The INTP is an extroverted, intuitive, extroverted feeler. Therefore, this is an excellent networker. Therefore, this is someone who is very socially aware of the plethoric social atmosphere. And therefore, absent a highly fluid, dominant opposing axis, they tend to be much more socially observant than they are necessarily willing to take responsibility for the emotions of the group. And oftentimes, again, relative to the dominant opposing axis, they will rely much more on other people to make a social decision on their behalf. The ISTP, on the other hand, while equally socially observant, observes a more precise social atmosphere. They do not focus as much on the group as the INTP does than they do on a more specific social scenario. They will often be more aware of various social microtransactions, but do not necessarily possess the same level of awareness of a broader social atmosphere as the INTP. However, this extrovert sensing lens makes the ISTP much more intense, and owing to the very concrete way in which they transmit their feelings to other people, as well as the very concrete and intense way they will be influenced by the specific emotions of a single other person, it can sometimes make the ISTP seem somewhat more emotionally engaged with the situation than the INTP. And finally, while in the more FI unconscious INTPs and ISTPs, both types will seek a kind of external role model, and in more FI conscious INTPs and ISTPs tend to form their identity upon what they can do and what frameworks they've concocted within their own mind. Introverted feeling otherwise has a tendency to be somewhat of a suppressed function within each of these types. And finally, the introverted feeling of the INTP is primarily connected to introverted intuition, and therefore it is much more plethoric and undulating. And generally, the INTP will be much more playful with their own identity. Whereas on the other hand, the ISTP's introverted feeling is predominantly connected to introverted sensing, and therefore their identity is oftentimes much more concrete. However, owing to its largely unconscious nature, but within both of these types, introverted feeling can be somewhat suppressed. And in these instances, these types will become somewhat oblivious to the degree to which they are being influenced by their own feelings, all the while thinking they have much more control over their feelings and general emotional maturity than they actually do. The authority function of the INTP is extroverted intuition, therefore this type is still very much drawn towards the abstract and holistic. However, they will oftentimes take abstract data from the external world and then consolidate it within very precise introverted thinking, introverted sensing frameworks. The ISTP, on the other hand, is the exact opposite of this. The authority function of the ISTP, therefore, is extroverted sensing. And as a result, we have a type who is much more drawn towards the tangible and concrete. And even in the more NI activated among these types, the various TI-NI innovations of this type will still be directed towards what is more tangible in nature. And again, this gives this type a more natural predisposition than, say, the INTP to being, say, an inventor or even an entrepreneur. Because you can apply a framework, you can innovate upon it, while simultaneously having very real and tangible concrete implications. So thank you so much for watching that. If you found it useful, definitely let me know down below in the comments. And also make sure to leave a like on the video because it really does help the channel grow, develop and reach new audiences. And for those of you who are still confused about your type after watching this video, I do offer a dedicated CPT type service, which I strongly recommend to both anyone who's interested in knowing what the type is or who wants additional clarification on what the type individually means to them. And if you know anyone who would benefit from this video, definitely make sure to share it with them. And if you have not already done so, make sure to click that subscribe button down below with the bell icon next to it. That way you can stay notified of future content. And if you haven't already checked out the CPT ebook, I definitely recommend you do so. I currently upload 2 CPT videos every week, Thursday and Sunday respectively. So I'll be back in a few days' time. For now, take care of yourself.